Speaker, I rise to offer Amendment 276.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 27, printed in House Report number 118-142, offered by Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 583, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me say first, I would like to yield myself 2.5 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate the Rules Committee permitting this to be in order to be discussed. These are important issues, and we don't often spend time on the floor discussing it. In my career, I've worked to contain nuclear weapons, their danger and cost. Many of these weapons we cannot afford and cannot afford to use. Unfortunately, we continue to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on weapons that pose serious risk to safety and physical security. We have an opportunity this afternoon to take a small but significant step, prohibiting the use of funds for the B83 bomb. This amendment reflects the conclusion of the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review, which unfortunately was not reflected in the majority report. The B83 was added to the nuclear arsenal 30 years ago and has dramatically diminished utility. Remember, we're on a trajectory to spend over $1.7 trillion in the next 30 years on nuclear weapons, most of which are no longer necessary for our security. Eliminating support for the B83 will save $1.5 billion over that period at no risk at all to our security. And as Everett Dirksen once famously said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon, you've got real money. Here's a chance to make a long overdue reform at no cost to our national security and save some real money. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
I rise in strong opposition to the amendment.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. This amendment would remove a section in the bill relating to the B83 nuclear gravity bomb and prohibit any funding for B83 sustainment. The B83 is the last megaton-class nuclear weapon in our arsenal. It exists to destroy deeply buried targets. China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran are putting some of the things they value most underground, covered in steel and concrete. The B83 is currently our only way of getting to those targets. When the Biden administration proposed to begin retiring the B83 last year, we asked, how are you going to replace them? They didn't have an answer. So Democrats and Republicans agreed on a provision in the FY23 NDAA that allowed the department to retire up to 25% of those bombs, but prohibited any further retirements until the department completed the study on how to replace that capability. As of today, the Biden Pentagon is still studying the problem, and we're not any closer to the B83 replacement. The language included in our bill repeats the bipartisan compromise struck in last year's NDAA, nothing more and nothing less. It also notes that this amendment would prohibit all sustaining funding for the B83. Not even the Biden administration thinks this is a good idea. Stockpile sustainment includes the safety and surveillance activities necessary to keep the nuclear weapons safe and secure. There is no exception in this amendment to allow for those activities to continue. Completely cutting off funds is irresponsible. I urge members to oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. We're in the midst of a major overhaul of our nuclear weapons system. It's a vast project. It is extraordinarily expensive. And in that process of reviving or reviewing and modifying our nuclear weapons system, this particular bomb becomes one of the items that is not necessary going forward. It basically has two uses. That is to wipe out a very large city with one bomb. This is a super megaton bomb. Or to somehow go after deeply buried, entrenched targets. And it's not particularly useful for that. And therefore, the Nuclear Posture Review has determined that this bomb should be retired. The amendment before us today allows for the continuation of the program to set about doing two things. One, retiring the 83-1, and two, figuring out a more suitable weapon to go after deeply entrenched targets. And therefore, this amendment is of use. I urge the passage of the amendment.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to yield at this time 1 minute to my friend and colleague from the Armed Services Committee, Doug Lambert of Colorado, the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. I rise in opposition to this amendment. I agree with my colleagues and share the chairman's concern about the safety risks with this amendment. I recognize that some of my colleagues believe we don't need the B83 and want to retire it, but regardless of how you feel about it, I hope my colleagues can appreciate that completely cutting off funds for a nuclear system all at once is dangerous. These weapons were built many decades ago and their components are aging, and that's why we're modernizing our deterrent. Yet you need to do ongoing safety and surveillance monitoring to ensure that they remain safe and secure, and that requires ongoing funding. So defunding a nuclear weapon may sound like a good talking point, but it's a reckless policy. Even the Biden administration understands that, and they're not proposing to cut off funding, but that's exactly what this amendment would do. I urge all my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the remaining time. I respectfully disagree with my colleagues. This is a weapon whose time has passed. We can't, it can only be delivered by the B-2 bomber, which is aging out. It cannot be delivered by a B-52 or a B-21. This antiquated weaponry is not enhancing our defense. It's an example of weaponry that really has outlived its usefulness. And these are serious issues. We're looking at trying to contain government spending. Some of my colleagues were willing to actually risk the global economy to make their point and grind things to a halt. This isn't low-hanging fruit. This is literally picking the fruit up off the ground. The security review, I think, is clear. This has outlived its usefulness. You've got to start somewhere. The $1.7 trillion that we have in the pipeline for nuclear modernization is, to be charitable, overkill. We need to start someplace. We ought to start with dealing with the B83, consistent with the National Security Review, and I yield back the balance of my time, urging approval of this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to an outstanding freshman member of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Strong of Alabama.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I also rise in opposition to the amendment. Chairman Rogers is exactly right. I want to emphasize one of the points that he made. The language in the bill which this amendment is proposing to strike is effectively the same language Congress agreed to last year. As the chairman said, this is a common sense provision that extends a restriction Congress passed on a bipartisan basis last year. The administration wants to retire a nuclear weapon, and we're saying, tell us how you're going to replace the capability before you retire it. That's a responsible policy, and I strongly oppose the amendment striking this provision. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I believe this amendment's bad policy. Not even the Biden administration is proposing to zero out this funding, and it would also be dangerous from a safety point of view. I urge all members to oppose this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.